Hi everyone! I am back in Quito, Ecuador now with good internet, and I'm able to record the class that we missed on Saturday. I'm so sorry about that. The internet that was supposed to be better was not, and I really do apologize for the poor connection and another asynchronous class, but I really didn't want you to miss out on any of the content from this week because it is really important. We're going to be talking about translanguaging and strategies. So we are already in Unit 4 of Module 7, and we're going to be talking about translanguaging and strategies for cross-linguistic transfer. And so this is what they call the +1 language domain. You know that we have 4 language domains for reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and the +1 is making metalinguistic connections. And that is where translanguaging comes into play. So your objectives for this week are the content is to describe the pedagogy, theory, and practice of translanguaging, as well as instructional strategies for cross-linguistic transfer. And you will reflect on your understanding of translanguaging and specifically how it increases student learning and equity in the classroom. That is really the key with translanguaging. It is an equity tool. It is a way to level the playing field for students to be able to use their full linguistic repertoire. So our language objective is that you can discuss translanguaging pedagogy with a group and create a digital presentation that explains how to implement it in the classroom. If we were able to meet in our VC, we would have discussed it as a group, but I explained that instead of doing partner work this week, I think it's better if you work individually on this, and I think that you'll be able to get more out of it. So let's start by reviewing some of the translanguaging pedagogy. We're going to watch this 1-minute video about what translanguaging is.
The first time I heard a description of translanguaging, I was like, what? No way. What is this crazy idea about mixing languages and letting the students use whatever they want in the classroom? I'm a university-trained language teacher, and my whole methodological background was founded on the principle of target language in the classroom. After extensive research and study, I realized that it isn't as crazy as it sounds. The crux of pedagogical translanguaging is accepting that languages can work together in the classroom rather than in competition, and teachers can plan strategically for students to use 2 languages for learning. There are many strategies teachers can use to integrate translanguaging into their classrooms. The first basic structure I train teachers to use is to vary the language of input, processing, and output in a learning cycle. An example. Imagine you are teaching a history class with learners from diverse language backgrounds. You allow the students to gather information on the topic in their own languages and then bring them together for a group discussion in English about what they have learned. Then they work separately to write a story in their own language and come together in groups again to rework the stories into English. In this way, they are building their learning through one language and transferring it to the other, a powerful cognitive strategy. And in the process, they are improving their academic skills in both languages. Translanguaging is an indispensable strategy for bilingual classrooms. It can also be used very successfully in multilingual classrooms. Translanguaging pedagogy is different with younger and older learners, but is beneficial for all ages. Implementing a translanguaging approach requires an openness to innovative practice as well as professional development and coaching. But to see it in action is to clearly understand the significant benefits for learners in terms of their own language development, their English development, their content learning, and their social development.
So when you think about translanguaging, another thing to keep in mind is that if it is to allow students to use their full linguistic repertoire, then it really does speak to allowing them to be themselves and embrace their own identity. And this is really important as we understand that English, for example, has such dominance in the world, and English holds a lot of power. And in order to create equitable spaces, we need to allow students to leverage their first language and see it as equally powerful as English. That's a really important thing for students to understand and to own, and that's an important part of translanguaging. Aside from the pedagogy, it aligns with the theory of students owning their first language as a way to embrace who they are and their culture. And let's watch this video now from Jim Cummins on language and identity.
When a student comes to school speaking a language other than the dominant school language, that's part of his or her identity. That's part of who they have been up to this point in time. Some students come to school speaking multiple languages. Many students may have been in refugee camps in different countries. They may have been in schools in different countries. They've learned multiple languages. And when that kind of linguistic capital is not acknowledged within the school, it's shutting off a lot of their accomplishments as not being relevant. And that communicates a message to the student that what they are is a second language learner of Swedish or English, an incompetent speaker of those languages in the early stages. Somebody who can't understand the textbooks and at the grade level. And so that's a process of negotiating identities, that if the teacher is not aware of the importance of language for the way students feel about themselves, it can have a very negative effect on the extent to which students will be willing to engage academically. And so rather than seeing students as multilingual students who have a variety of linguistic accomplishments, who have maybe had a wide range of experiences, who have got to Sweden or got to Canada based on their extraordinary intelligence, their initiative, their ability to survive and their resilience. We see students sometimes only as somebody who needs help, somebody who is deficient in the language of instruction. And when we put students into that identity cocoon, we risk diminishing them in terms of who they are and who they can be. And we know also that those teacher expectations can get internalized by the students. And many of them will say, well, I'm not that bright. I'm not ever going to make it to high school. I'm not going to make it to college or university. Why bother making the effort? I'll go out and try and become a mechanic or do something relatively low level in terms of professional qualifications within the society. And so when teachers understand more about the crucial role that language and language learning plays in students' sense of self and in their academic aspirations, then I think they can look at ways of communicating to students that their multilingualism or their knowledge of their home language is an important intellectual accomplishment. It's something that they should cherish, that they should continue to develop. It's important also to communicate this message to parents, because parents don't know this. And so when we look at the role of language, the role that language plays in identity, there's all kinds of implications for how we interact with students and how we organize the curriculum. And this is not just at the level of the individual teacher, it's at the level of the school. Does the school have a policy in relation to students' multilingualism? Is the implicit policy communicated to students that they should leave their languages, their cultures at the schoolhouse door, that they're not really relevant in the school environment? That's incredibly diminishing of communities and individual students. And schools that take a much more positive orientation to students' multilingualism, bring it into classroom, encourage students to carry out work in their home languages as well as in English or Swedish or whatever the school language might be. For example, through writing dual language books, tend to succeed much better because students are feeling acknowledged for their accomplishments. They adopt a much more positive attitude towards their home language. They're more curious about their parents' cultural background and their experiences. And students, these schools are vibrant places. And teachers are happier in these schools.
So when you think about that video from Jim Cummins and what he says about language and identity, keep in mind that translanguaging promotes an additive type of thinking versus subtractive thinking. So instead of looking at students who are learning a second language as deficient, as he describes, which would be subtractive, you are thinking that they are bringing a full linguistic repertoire from different languages, maybe several languages that also are tied to their experiences, and that is an additive approach. And when I see this video, it makes me think about my own students who come from Central America and who have had a wide range of experiences, and maybe some coming through crossing borders and having to navigate some very risky and scary experiences. That's part of their identity, and I need to recognize that. And so when they come in understanding Spanish because that is what their family speaks, and they are also acquiring English because the world around them suddenly is in English, then I'm going to embrace that and help them to embrace it as well. And that is very empowering. So that is what Jim Cummins is talking about there. So now we're going to get into a little bit of translanguaging pedagogy, and we're going to talk about the translanguaging corriente. Corriente means river flowing. And when we look at translanguaging, we want to think of students using their linguistic repertoire as their and using language-specific performance and using a very dynamic range of different linguistic types of uses that embrace their whole being, right? So they're making metalinguistic connections in their brains between the different languages. And there are three important things to consider when you're thinking about the translanguaging corriente, and that is stance, design, and shifts. I love this quote about the translanguaging corriente. It says, "We use the metaphor of the translanguaging corriente to refer to the current or flow of students' dynamic bilingualism that runs through our classrooms and schools. Bilingual students make use of the translanguaging corriente either overtly or covertly to learn content and language in school and to make sense of their complex worlds and identities." That quote and the translanguaging pedagogy strands are from this amazing book called The Translanguaging Classroom. I highly, highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. And it's written by Ofelia Garcia, Susana Ibarra Johnson, and Kate Seltzer. And Ofelia Garcia in particular is a pioneer in translanguaging pedagogy. So we're going to look at a couple of things from this book so that you can understand these pedagogy strands of stance, design, and shifts. The first strand is stance. And what that means is teachers with a translanguaging understanding and a translanguaging stance are those that leverage students' bilingualism for learning. That means that teachers embrace that bilingual students have one holistic language repertoire to draw from at school, and that the purposes of translanguaging are to support students as they engage with and comprehend complex texts and content, provide opportunities for students to develop linguistic practices for academic contexts, make space for students' bilingualism, which means in the traditional sense where we expect students to come in and speak the target language only, that is literally like taking, I explained to you before about how when you're playing the drums and you play with the drums with two sticks, if you don't embrace students' full bilingualism and recognize and leverage the gifts that they have to come into the classroom with already, then it's like taking away one of the sticks and asking them to beat the drum with just one. That's what that means. And so taking a translanguaging stance is by allowing them to have both drumsticks to engage with the content, right? Allowed them to use both of their languages to engage with the content. It does not mean concurrent translation. It means strategically using their first language to help them acquire the second. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then number 4 is the stance means that teachers understand how to support students' socio-emotional development and bilingual identities. Strand number 2 is design and instruction. So translanguaging design and instruction refers to how we strategically plan instruction to work within the translanguaging corriente. So like I just said, translanguaging is not concurrent translation where you just would translate something in English and then in the second language. What it is planning strategically for these moments where you're going to weave in the first language to help students acquire the second. In this example, this picture here, it's an example of bridging. So this would be a strategic design and instruction where we've talked about how to bring in anchor charts with students. This is an example of a science lesson where students were learning about different habitats and animals that live in different habitats, this picture on the left. And after they learned the vocabulary in Spanish, the English teacher and I came together to bridge the two languages, and we taught a lesson on cognates and on some initial sounds. So the English teacher taught them the English word for the animal name, and they had already learned the word in Spanish. And so we used a picture. I reviewed with the students the names of the animals, and you see that we have the color allocation in our bridging lesson. So in Spanish, the words are in, all of the text is in orange, and in English, as I reviewed this, the English teacher would teach the students the word in English and use blue for English content. So this bridging lesson is bringing the two languages together to deepen the content through the context. So this is a level 1 bridge on the left because we are learning we're learning cognates specifically. And the second picture on the right is an example of a level 2 bridge, which is students in this example had already learned in literacy beginning, middle, and end in a story. They also had learned multiple types of vocabulary for different content that we had covered, and we were learning the letter CH in Spanish and in English. So here, this bridging lesson took a couple of days where we taught beginning, middle, and end that they had already learned in Spanish in literacy, and the English teacher came in and taught them those words in English. And we did some examples with the text. And then in the text and in the classroom, we looked for words that had CH in them. And then what we did was we asked the students to find the CH at the beginning of the word, in the middle of the word, or at the end of the word. So it's slightly different than their literacy lesson, but it also intertwines because they're using that vocabulary in different contexts. So this is really asking them to do a lot of critical thinking. So that's an example of a level 2 bridge. So these are two examples of how we would strategically plan instruction to work within the translanguaging corriente. We're bringing in the two languages to deepen the content through the context. Another example here, this is an example of a 3rd grade lesson. This is actually a lesson for, it's prior to a social emotional learning lesson over when we were doing online teaching this past year. This teacher actually taught the students what translanguaging is. And that's a really important thing, to teach the students that you are going to learn how to use your first language to acquire the second, and teaching them specifically that this is the +1 language domain where your brain is going to make metalinguistic connections. And so teaching the students what translanguaging is and how their brain makes the connections gives students the why. They understand then that it is really important for their brains to make these connections, because then they're learning how to be bilingual, and they get very, very excited and very invested in the learning this way. So after that third grade teacher taught them what translanguaging is, the students, well, actually, this was third grade, so they already knew what it was, but because they had in previous classes. But let's say in kindergarten, we actually teach them what it is. But obviously, we review with them throughout the grades. So that teacher was reviewing with them what translanguaging is. And then when he got into the SEL lesson, the social emotional learning lesson, he and the English teacher, he's the English teacher, he and the Spanish teacher did a translanguaging lesson, so a bridging lesson together on the word of the week for their SEL lesson. So translanguaging bridging lessons can be done and should be done with any type of academic content. And here they are building the students' vocabulary in both languages so that they can understand the content for the SEL lesson. So in our school, they had a word of the week. And so and here they had a couple of different words that they were going to need to learn and reiterate from prior weeks. So in this particular week, the word was gratitude, but then they weaved in community, kindness, and support from previous weeks that the students were going to need to understand for the SEL lesson. So providing students space to use their full linguistic repertoire and design instruction to include scenarios for learning and invite collaboration is really, really important for students to understand the content. And here on this slide, the teacher is using cognates and reiterating and asking students, how does the word look? How does it sound? What's different? What's the same? And this helps to deepen the context by teaching cognates and helping students then when they are on their own or listening to a story or reading or whatever, writing, then they actually can identify these cognates and make these metalinguistic connections in their brains, and that is going to help them to really deepen their understanding. Here in this slide, the teacher is asking them to be detectives and find patterns of the language. So here they're learning the endings of the name and this is an example of a level 2. So there he has the first slide, which was just the cognates here. He just has the cognates and they review the cognates. Now he's going to do a level 2 bridge, and they're going to learn the endings and the differences of the endings and understand the language patterns. And this is going to help students tremendously with their vocabulary building. So and again, this is all in prior to a social emotional learning lesson. So students are learning some morphology here, learning word endings and studying the similarities and differences in the different cognates. And he and the Spanish teacher are reiterating that the students are making metalinguistic connections and that they are practicing their +1 language domain. So once they do those two level 1 and level 2 bridging anchor charts with the cognates and the morphology, then they may read a story, have a discussion, and then at the end, they're going to wrap up what they learned. And this is explicitly teaching students how they are making the metalinguistic connections. So they're asking the question here, what did I learn? I learned about these endings. So I actually learned what morphology is, and that is a language pattern. In Spanish, the DAD converts to TY in English. And so they learn that when a cognate in Spanish ends with DAD, it changes to TY in English. And so this is a very, very powerful way to explicitly teach students how they are making the metalinguistic connections and wrapping up the lesson. Strand 3 of the translanguaging corriente is shifts. And translanguaging shifts refer to those unplanned moment-to-moment decisions that teachers make in response to the flow of the translanguaging corriente. So that means that you respond to content and language needs and interests not built directly into a unit. So that means that you need to be flexible to listen to your students, understand your students, and take those teachable moments that come along and dig into them a little deeper. And so an example here, this picture is when I was teaching a couple of years ago. I was at my guided reading table teaching a lesson, and I overheard at another table some students at a literacy center talking. And I heard a student make a racially disparaging remark in Spanish. And so I stopped everything. I listened to what they were saying first, but then I stopped and I called all the kids to the carpet. And we did, right then and there, we did a translanguaging lesson on 2 books on skin color and embracing differences and recognizing similarities. So this is where, you have these teachable moments, but you also need to be always doing your own kind of listening and researching, and you have to be kind of embrace the idea of being passionate about this equity piece yourself as a teacher so that you can catch these teachable moments. Because when I heard this student making these remarks, and she was 5 years old, and she said something like, "My dad doesn't like Black people," and I thought, wait a second, I can't let that go, right? But what do? So I had already in my classroom library some books that I knew that would help students kind of unpack this, right? So I stopped everything. I pulled out these 2 books, We Are a Rainbow and All the Colors We Are, and I did my own translanguaging lesson. So if you know the other target language, then you can do it yourself, and you can color code yourself, right? You could do what we did here, because I didn't have the English teacher in my room with me to do something that we had planned together. What I did was I took the 2 books and I did a picture walk with them in English, and then I read the story in Spanish, so that I'm still staying true to my language allocation in my Spanish classroom, but I'm weaving in English so that they understand some of the context in a deeper way for those that don't understand. And so then what I did was I asked a question. Are we that different? So I made an anchor chart with the students right then and there. And so the picture asks, are we that different? And I tied it to the content after we read the book. And so I picked out some of the content, and we had a discussion. And so we talked as a class that what's different about us? We speak different languages. That's what it says here. And then all of a sudden, all the students started to raise their hands and tell me what languages they spoke at home. And we had Spanish, English, Korean, I had Portuguese, I had Russian, I had Hindi, right? So I had all these different languages that my students in the classroom in front of me spoke at home. And so then we talked about how do you say hello at home? And so then the students, I don't know how to say hello in all of these languages. So I asked the students to come up, and if they could write it, some of them could write it. I had them come up and write it. If they didn't know how, I actually looked it up on Google Translates. We did that. We did our own little research together, and we wrote it, right? And it doesn't matter if it's exactly right. We're all embracing these other languages. And so then we talked about, okay, well, that's something that's different about us, and that's okay. We have different languages, and then we read a book on skin color and we looked at our arms and what does everybody's skin color look like, and look at your friend next to you and compare. Oh, mine is peach, yours is brown, yours is darker brown, yours is lighter brown, and things like that. And that's okay. That's great. So we unpacked the issue without making that student that said the remark feel bad, right? Because students, especially particularly very young students, they're bringing in things from home, and I wanted to unpack it without shaming any of the students. So that is how an example of how I took a teachable moment and we unpacked the idea of embracing our differences. Okay, so for activity 1, what is translanguaging? You have some resources that probably you've already seen by now, and we are going to not work in groups for this one. So individually, you are going to create a Powtoon presentation, ideally, or a similar video presentation tool. There's some great ones that you can use for free, and it doesn't matter if they have a watermark on them. Sometimes you use the free resources and they unless you pay, you have to have a watermark, which is completely fine. A good one that I like is called Vyond, V-Y-O-N-D. That's a really fun tool, as is Powtoon. And what you're going to do is you're going to create a Powtoon or a Vyond or whatever other tool you want to explain what translanguaging is, why it is effective, and how it should be implemented in the classroom to enhance learning for linguistically diverse learners. So your presentation should include a working definition of translanguaging, a description of the pedagogy and theory behind translanguaging, a brief one, how it is used to create access to content for students, and description of cross-linguistic transfer, so like the examples that I gave about the strategies in the classroom, and how translanguaging creates equity for language learners. All of this should be, related to the resources and references that you have in the activity resources section. And as you are developing your knowledge of translanguaging, pay special attention to how the practice of using a student's full linguistic repertoire adds equity by creating access to content in the classroom. So try to make your presentation around 5 minutes or so, okay? So make sure I think Powtoon and Vyond you can use up to, I think, over 5 minutes. Okay, so for activity 2, we're going to talk about translanguaging and assessment. And your objectives are that you're going to work individually to create an assessment tool using strategies and principles of translanguaging for the grade level and subject area that you teach or that you plan to teach. So your language objective is you can write an assessment tool that includes principles and strategies for translanguaging. Okay, so here are some general principles for translanguaging and assessment, and these are also from the Translanguaging Classroom book. So the idea is you want to continuously monitor what students are learning and give formative feedback. This is an area that is so critical, and often the way that we're assessing our students in bilingual classrooms is really designed for monolingual students and not bilingual students. And that's where teachers often become frustrated and think that their students aren't acquiring the language when likely they are, but it's just that our assessments are not designed for assessing them for the content. We're trying to assess always language, but if we are working to create assessments that are monitoring what they know and giving them feedback, then that is going to be much more reflective of what the students actually can do. So thinking again of that additive way of thinking and thinking about what they can do versus the deficit thinking of what they are deficient in. Right? We don't want to think that they're deficient in anything. They are acquiring language, and it is a process. So the first thing we want to think about is assessment for bilingual students means that teachers evaluate what students can do with content and language on school-based tasks. We want to think that performance assessments must include opportunities to use multiple resources to show what they are working on in their bilingual zone of proximal development. So we want to be able to allow them to show what they know and what they can do. And that means by giving them some scaffolds like vocabulary lists, sentence frames, those graphic organizers, allowing them to do their first draft in their first language and then put it together in their second, work in groups, performance-based tasks. Number 3 is really important. It's really important too that our assessments are authentic. This is where we get into trouble with so many standardized tests that are not designed for bilingual learners. Again, they're designed for monolingual, mostly English-speaking students. And that is not a reflection of what they can do. So thinking about, project-based learning, performance-based tasks, showing, through their, maybe they don't have, they've read a story and you're asking them to describe the beginning, middle, and end, but they don't have all of the vocabulary to produce it orally, but they could draw a picture. Maybe they can't write it out yet. You can give them a sentence frame and have them fill in that blank with some vocabulary using a word bank, things like that. Those are really, really important so that students can show what they can do, and they just need some of that support. And again, thinking about language use must not restrict emergent bilinguals to demonstrate content understanding. So we want to use those supports so that students can demonstrate what they can do, because likely they need to be able to use their multiple language domains to show what they know for assessment. So for an assessment tool, looking at this picture from the Translanguaging classroom, we want to think about this is, the star is the assessment, and we're looking at the assessment from many different angles. We have the teacher integrative class assessment. So this would be where maybe you're doing a formative assessment by listening to student responses, or they're on the carpet and they all have whiteboards and they're answering questions either orally or written, and you're watching, right? Maybe here you have a teacher assessment where it might be something a little bit more formal. That might be one part of the overall assessment. You have student self-assessment. Let the students assess themselves and assess each other through peer and group assessment. Groupings are really powerful ways to let students show what they know and assess each other. And then family assessment. Make connections with the families, helping students and their families understand how translanguaging is an important piece of embracing students' language acquisition, is something that families don't understand, and administrators, quite frankly, don't understand. So, by providing information to our families and our administrators, it's going to help us to be able to use more authentic types of assessments in our own classrooms. And that's where we have to think back to that strand of a teacher's stance and advocating for what we know is best practice. So for number one, we want to think about, is the student performing using all of these features of their language repertoire and or using language specific features? So if we are assessing them just on vocabulary, and we're only allowing them one type of way to show what they know through like a fill in the blank, that's not an authentic assessment. That's not enough. That's only one piece of this whole integrative assessment type of tool. And number two, is the student performing independently with moderate assistance from other people or resources, or is the performance emergent? So think about that when you're watching how the students are performing through this integrative approach. Do they need more supports? You could use the ACTFL can-do descriptors the ACTFL proficiency standards and the WIDA can-do descriptors to help you figure out where they are in their language proficiency levels. And that will help you to develop different types of assessments that can help show what they really can do. All of that is really, really important to get a full picture of what the students can do. Okay, so what you're going to do here for activity 2 is you're going to individually read the required resources on authentic assessment and translanguaging, and use the Moreland Library to research one new strategy for effective assessment using translanguaging practices. I remember getting a couple of emails from some candidates that said that they were having trouble getting onto the Moreland Library. You should be able to get on with your Moreland account. So if you can't for any reason, then please reach out to the help desk. They should get back to you very quickly to troubleshoot that. So you're going to create an assessment tool that evaluates students' skills in reading, writing, listening, speaking in a particular subject area using translanguaging principles. So let's say, for example, you're going to assess them in reading. You're assessing them in reading, but you may be weaving in the other domains as a way to assess their reading. So think about it in terms of that. Okay, it's okay to use their different domains to check for a certain skill. So like if you're going to check for their listening, you could, have them integrate some of their reading, writing, and speaking as well, right? So the tool that you're going to create can be used for a formative assessment or a summative assessment. And it can be digital or a paper or pencil tool. It's completely up to you. But think of ways that you can meet students' diverse needs and develop assessments that will allow students to demonstrate their skills using their full linguistic repertoire. So make sure that you're allowing them space to use their first language along with their second. And think back to what you're what you learned from Activity 1 on the translanguaging pedagogy and those resources to help you develop an effective, authentic, and culturally sustaining assessment tool for your language learners. And then the last piece, really important, don't forget to either write or you can record a summary of yourself. If you want to use a recording instead of writing, that's fine for this activity. And describe how you would use your assessment tool for the grade level and subject area that you teach or would like to teach, and include the strategies and key ideas from your research in your description. So if you record a summary and you're referring to the resources, please provide on the platform a separate resource page, okay? A resource document. Okay, and then your last activity, activity 3, I hope that this will be a really fun, creative part for you. So you have been doing some blogs and created your own sites for the blogs for up to this point in the program. And for activity 3, you're going to finalize your e-portfolio. So if you used Google Sites, for example, for your blog, or Weebly or whatever, now you're going to take it a step further and you're going to actually create your own website, which is called an e-portfolio. So make sure that you link your blog to your website, and your website should have a page that has like a profile bio page about you, maybe put some photos or images in the background, and then have a couple of different pages. So one for your blog, one for your some of your highlights of your best work up to this point. You want to link some there, and reflect on your learning so that you can make something that you can use maybe later to put on your resume, for example. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is my I have a couple of different websites that I've created, but this is one that I have that is my blog, but also has some other information. So here I have my title page, and I have a background of when we went to Vancouver. It was so cool, right? So I have some information about me, and my blog flows, right? I have a couple of videos that from when I was making some story read-alouds for my students during COVID. I have some stuff that I've worked on in some other classes for when I was doing my master's. I have some different web tools that I use that kind of are nice to kind of put in one spot, and some different things that I've written, right? So you have that already because you've been writing your blog for your class. You also have some of your work that you've been doing up to this point. So here, this for my master's program, I didn't do it with Moreland, but very similar. I had a very similar project. That's why I'm showing you this as an example. Here I have a project that I had to do that related to using technology in the classroom. Okay, and then you want to have a couple of different pages. So here I have my blog, then you can go to About, and it has a little bio about me and my family or whatever, my career, right? So you want to add that. Contact information if you want, okay? More pictures. This is where I am right now. This is Ecuador. This is a picture of Ecuador at this really cool place that we were at, very close to where I am right now, my in-laws' house in Quito, Ecuador. Okay, so you're going to, let me go back to the assignment. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to reflect on your own learning up to this point and how it connects to your teaching practice and your future professional development. So the idea with this e-portfolio is for you to create something similar to what I just showed you, so that you can have this kind of ongoing website that you can add to for your own professional development. So look through your blog and make it more of a formalized e-portfolio. And whatever work that you have that you would like to highlight from your work in the program up to this point, you want to think about, like, does it represent my growth? And is it representative of, my best work? And you want to add the links. And you're going to upload it onto the platform, and you're going to review the e-portfolios of at least 2 of your cohort peers and post a comment with some suggestions on how they can use their portfolio when they complete the program, or if they may need to make any adjustments and changes, okay? And you can go ahead and make some adjustments and changes. So that is activity 3, and that's it, guys. I hope that this was helpful to you. As you can see, I have really good internet. I have all 3 bars going, so I hope I have no issues with our Zoom for this coming Saturday. And I'm getting all caught up on my grading, so we'll be good to go, and I will see you all soon. I hope you're doing very, very well. Talk to you later. Bye.